welcome everyone to the From Specialist to Strategist webinar series. It's great to have you all here with us as always. This is a community where we support professionals who are considering a transition from technical specialist roles to more strategic leadership positions, whether you're in biopharma, tech or other industries. The goal is really to provide some practical insights to kind of bridge knowledge and skill gaps in leadership areas like strategic thinking, people management, hiring, time management, performance management, and a lot more. We've covered lots of topics already and we'll get into more in the future. These are kind of the essential leadership skills that technical experts may not have traditionally encountered in their previous kind of STEM training and earlier training that they've had. So everything we've discussed on these is based on the views and opinions of those participating and not necessarily of their respective companies, either past or present. And in today's episode, it's a particularly important one because it focuses, I think, on a foundational aspect of effective leadership, which is diversity and building inclusive teams. Building teams that kind of seek to include diverse perspectives are thought to lead to more innovative, resilient and successful organisations. And we're going to go into that today. So we're very grateful to welcome Autumn Huffman with us today, who's a career service director specialising in education and career access for marginalised communities. I think to care about a topic like this speaks a lot for your own career and also for those people around you. So I applaud everyone who's with us here today watching this episode and who's going to watch the recording in the future. It shows, you're good people and you care about the environment in which you work. So with that, I'd invite you all to load your questions into the chat for Autumn as we go through, and we'll endeavour to cover everything. So
I'm going to pick up on the chat as usual. Going to comment and then basically throw the questions over to Autumn as we progress.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthias. Yeah, so Autumn, it'd be lovely if we could start by learning a little bit about your background, how you got into career development and how you got interested in kind of this topic of creating diverse and inclusive work environments.
Absolutely. So let's see, I think it was Benedict in the chat said, I actually, my background was actually in academia. I wanted to be a researcher and a collegiate educator. And I was actually working on my doctorate. And then while I was doing that, there was a diversity initiative taking place at that school. It had a kind of a problematic history with integration. So they were priority bringing on students of color, which is awesome, giving them scholarships, except this school was in a state that was 50th in education. So a lot of the students they were bringing in were from very poor backgrounds, which in one way on its face, it's like, great, maybe you wouldn't have been able to access college otherwise. However, when I was teaching intro freshman composition and writing, which is the class they give you to teach when you're a lowly graduate student, a lot of these students didn't have collegiate level literacy. And so it kind of turned my stomach. You're going to give all these people this access, but you're not going to give them the set of tools and supports necessary to make them competitive and have an equal state likelihood in earning their degree. So myself and a bunch of my other graduate students kind of put together a kind of literacy outreach program that is actually now a regular funded, hired, non-volunteer part of that university, which is lovely, but at the time it was quite scrappy. And that experience is pretty formative because it's really instilled in me pretty deeply that it's not enough to bring diverse people in. You have to have the supports to include them in that environment, to give them what they need to succeed, to give them what they need to compete. And I think I got into careers from that because I made a career transition from there and fell in love with it. And also when I was working as a graduate student, I worked as a career coach because it had flexible hours. But I started approaching it from a much different place, thinking it more through on the lens of what is now known as DEIB. So I started consulting. I worked at some nonprofits. I worked at some ed techs. Currently, I'm consulting for my local school board, trying to create more and more support structures, wraparounds, and just educational supports for internal and external groups, trying to find ways to make things more equitable in whatever community will have me come boss them around. So that's a little bit about me. I live in the US. I actually live in Florida. Please don't judge me. And I have a kid and too many animals, and we won a fish at the fair last year, and it's still alive. So that's my biggest accomplishment to date.
Have you managed to avoid the hurricanes this season then? Autumn?
They've gone mercifully around my area, both big hurricanes. That was really stunning luck for us. So yes, we're safe.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, very lucky because it looked like horrendous, the pictures that were coming through. So
Pretty awful.
yeah, pretty awful. Yeah, so thanks for giving us a quick tour of your background and how you got into all this interest in diversity and career coaching and everything. As Matea said, I kind of fall into it a lot of the time, don't you, career coaching? And people agreeing in the chat. So I guess we could get into the topic a little bit about diversity and just the reason why it's important for companies and organizations to actually care about this topic.
Well, there are a number of reasons. I mean, idealistically, of course, I think we should all have in our heart a commitment to making sure that everyone in our community has a chance to succeed and participate. But I think what tends to be a more compelling argument when I give these talks, especially to industry leaders, is, there have been several studies. A very popular one from 2019 that's pretty seminal, the McKinsey report, for instance, prove without a doubt that the more diverse in terms of ethnic, racial, neurodivergence, and gender composition. They didn't look at queer factors at this particular study, but several others do. The more diverse, actually, the more financially successful companies tend to be. There's a lot of really great data on this. But when you strip that down, there are a few key reasons for that. And I think the main is diverse people have diverse experience. They think differently. They have had different mistakes happen to them, by them, to their community. So they have different perceptions of risk and opportunity. And the more people you have in a room with a more diverse idea of where the risks and opportunities lie, the better chance you have to see around corners, to maximize opportunities, and also to create a workplace where people feel like their voice matters and they're encouraged to share those ideas, so they're not as likely to keep them to themselves or to just, bail and go work for someone else. And I think that when you look at it on that highest possible level, it really just makes sense. It just makes sense to the heart, to the mind, to the reasonable capabilities and all rational brains. So I think that's the best answer I have for that.
To kind of jump into that, because this is not exactly new knowledge if we're thinking about this, but when I look at how organizations are structured, a lot of us have experience with academia, which once you're basically moving at what we call the Mittelbau in German universities, where you have for example, a larger representation of women. If you go on to professor levels, we're still looking at, as far as I know, low double-digit percentages when you're looking at professorship. I know this from kind of Germanosphere universities, and I know that change obviously takes time, but I struggle sometimes to believe that we're basically still having to discuss this in 2024, given the fact that we've sat on this knowledge for so long. What do you think? What do you think is holding us back so massively?
What do I think is holding us back? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. You cut off
Yeah.
just a little. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a couple of reasons for this, ranging from cynical to pragmatic. To begin cynically, if I was a person who had all the power in the world, perhaps I wouldn't want to include additional groups of people that would disagree with me and make it harder for me to get my way and retain power. Um, but I think that that's quite cynical. I don't think very many people walk around knowingly thinking that way. I think much more realistically, people will get anxious about change. And I think that that's pretty well hardwired. And I think that a lot of the time people aren't thinking about change like, oh, well, I don't want any women up here, even though I'm sure some do. Misogynists exist in the same way racists exist. But I think more likely it's like, well, no, this is the way we do it, and we're tremendously successful. And if some woman comes here and she fits the mold of what we're doing, she'd be welcome to come, which is how we get tokenism. But, I think that people also at a certain level aren't used to being disagreed with. I think there are lots of cultures that are, becoming more accustomed to hearing from a wider range of folks. But then I think pragmatically, the truth of the matter is it has taken time for the composition of the workplace to increasingly represent these ideas. So women in boardrooms is statistically a far greater reality than it was, I think it was in the 70s when there was like a large push for this to start happening. Having specifically Black board members is also becoming more common. It's still, wildly knocked back by the presence of, cis white men. But it takes a long time for the group of people that have power in the organization to be the group of people who were, came of age in one way or another when those ideas began to become forefront, Something I think about a lot is in the early 90s, there was a push for something that like racial diversity in the workplace, being colorblind and not seeing color. I don't know if any of y'all remember this. Now, of course, you don't have to be an academic in this space to be like, oh, cringe when you see things like that, that kind of erasure. There's a lot of scholarship that's like a kind of like post-colonial erasure of identity. But at the time, that was so progressive. At that time, it was met with a huge backlash from a lot of white communities, but it was an attempt to be inclusive. Now, of course, how outdated. But the people who were coming of age in the early 90s are a lot of your CEOs, now, people who are in the workplace. And, for them, that might still seem like enough. I don't want to get too into this idea of progress that, is in some ways an illusion, in some ways a reality. But folks that are, raised under a certain zeitgeist tend to forward that zeitgeist as they go. Women have been climbing the ranks and becoming a more normal part of the workplace. You see them holding more positions of power. But that's not true, for instance, for people with autism, because that's not something that has been forwarded, which isn't to say there are no autistic CEOs. It's to say that hasn't been a part of a conversation until recently. And honestly, if the culture isn't pushing it, a lot of people aren't thinking about it, and they don't care, and they don't value it as a result. So big, sad answer for you there, but I think a practical one backed by research.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something there that I think resonated with me, the idea that getting challenged, I guess as a senior leadership team, it's nice to come up with ideas and strategies and like put them out into the organization and have managers and other senior people within the organization agree. But in the short term, that kind of agreement and enjoyment of being in that workplace where you've got that kind of group thing is not going to be sufficient, is it, to compete? Because you're going to be blindsided. You're not going to be challenged on any of your strategic points. And I just wonder if, leadership teams, as they are at the minute, maybe like to surround themselves with those environments where they're not as challenged as they may otherwise be by people with diverse approaches and ways of thinking of things. I mean, is it that simplistic or is that too simplistic?
I'll answer this in another way. I feel like a politician. I'm going to answer something slightly to the left of what you just asked. But I think it's okay. Imagine you are deep into your career, whether this is true or not. Everyone here, no matter where you are, imagine you are really at this place where you are ready to be hired on as the head of like a whole division, you know, oodles of direct reports, indirect reports, really controlling the strategy and execution of an entire branch of a business. Let's say you're like the head of marketing at a big company or something, right? Or the head of research at a big company. By the time you get to this point, you have so much experience. And this is what you're essentially being paid for, your judgment and your experience. And I mean, you've probably worked very hard to get there. And when you're in the strategy phase, if it's for something in your domain, it's very tempting to think you have all the answers ready-made. I think that people tend to be more willing to compromise when it's from somebody who owns a different domain. So, for instance, even though there's statistically more likely to be interdepartmental friction between, let's say, product departments and sales departments, the back and forth and idea exchange is statistically much higher and better because I think it's easier for, engineers to imagine they don't know anything about sales and for salespeople to imagine they don't know anything about engineering. But what happens with two similar departments, like there's statistically a really amusing set of stats that instructional designers often post on LinkedIn that have to do with usually instructional designers are in charge of working with subject matter experts to create materials, and the amount of infighting that happens between the people who know how to make the instructional design and the subject matter experts on the way to do it is in the extreme because these are similar and overlapping areas of information. So it's like, I know what I'm doing and you don't. I think that people often view challenge to their viewpoints as a stripping away of their credentials, and that's simply and that can be the case. Don't get me wrong, but 9 times out of 10, it's just what it is, a different viewpoint. And odds are, if you could take the kernel of information out of that and out of your idea and combine them, you'll come up with maybe a better strategy altogether. So I think it's just deeply human to not want to be challenged and to be quite defensive when challenged. And that's why, I don't know about y'all, but literally every single leadership thing I've ever been to has an enormous section on not being defensive and, accepting, critique and pushback. Matthias, I see your hand.
Yeah, this is really interesting how we're just veering into the overarching topic of our webinars, which is about moving from expertise, technical expertise, or expertise in specialist expertise in a specific area, and then somehow transcending into often leadership positions where you are responsible for things outside your specialist area. And what I think, if I understood you correctly, you're kind of looking at a dynamic that works against cooperation here, because any thought outside the expertise or that questions the individual's expertise may increase tension and the feeling that people are being disenfranchised. And I think this is one of the reactions that people often get when it comes to diversity-focused activities, that they're starting to feel disenfranchised because the way they've been working is being questioned and they're being suggested to work or interact in a different way. I find that really fascinating how those two things seem to be kind of working in parallel as dynamics.
I completely agree. I think that I do think in the last 10 years, there has been a greater focus on where these kinds of questions about diversity intersect with questions of leadership. But honestly, once you let that subject matter overlap, I really find it impossible to separate them. I think something I think about a lot is, so like in a agile workplace, which is like everybody's doing agile or like some bastardized version of agile. It's like not quite, but kind of like, does anyone do waterfall anymore? I feel like they just do like hybrid or agile. And like when you think about it, the point of agile is to move quickly. So you're just bouncing between iteration and going to your stakeholders again and again and again. And obviously there's other steps with like research and testing, but like you're essentially just bouncing between these two things over and over. And in a way, that makes total sense. They're trying to not let the project get too far before people could say, that won't work. That won't work. And in a way, like bringing in your stakeholders is a version of diversity on a certain level. I really can't say enough. Diversity is not working unless you take the most diverse version of what diversity means. And some of that is subject matter expertise, area of influence. Like for instance, I think that if you looked at the three people leading this chat now, Vicky, Matthias, and myself, it's like, okay, three white people. You know, how diverse are they? But then you cut a little deeper. Originally, Matthias is German. Vicky, we haven't talked about this, but you sound very British. So she's nodding. I'm from the US. I am neurodivergent and queer and don't identify within the gender binary. Matthias has lived more places than anyone I've ever met and speaks like 5 languages, and again, I'm not bragging on Vicky enough because we only met recently, whereas I've known Matthias for some time, but like, you start getting into these different areas and our different backgrounds and how we came into our work and, the amount of science Vicky seems to know in comparison to myself and Matthias, despite wanting to be astronauts when we were younger. And, you get into these areas of influence and then you start thinking like, okay, so we can bring 3 different attitudes to a similar topic, even in this conversation. In the organism that is a business, there is a certain amount that we've embraced an idea of diversity of experience, where that experience means work. But the blind spots that we're trying to fill in now is where just because I am a different person than you, even if we have identical experience, I will have a different perspective, and that perspective is more likely to be inflected by identity factors, whether that be the way the world has interacted with me because of the color of my skin or my gender or who I date publicly or, if I went to university or not, if I was raised in the US or somewhere else, if I speak multiple languages. Being bilingual affects the way your brain passes information because you have a more abstract relationship to ideas. Do you know what I mean? Because language is idea abstraction. Dyslexic people tend to think in big to small instead of small to big, and they tend to think differently. There are lots of different ways that people can inflect a conversation. And that's really what diversity is about. And inclusion is finding ways for people to feel like they can share those things, I'd say generally, but in this case, with the company, with their leaders, with their team. That was kind of a wandering lane of an answer. So I hope it made any sense to non-Autumns.
Well, we're all nodding away, so I think it makes sense to us. I'm just speaking for everybody there. I mean, from the number of things you said there, I mean, so true. If I think about a bold example of how diversity can affect teams and improve them, I work in the medical writing field. I've worked in lots of organizations, different companies within that field. And all the time we get emails pinged through, who can speak this language? Who speaks Mandarin? Who can speak Swedish? Because we've got a new project or a client in a particular geography. And suddenly, we need those expertise and skills and cultural understanding and all sorts of things. So, that's just a really, prime example of how diversity can improve an organization. But in terms of how then you should try to get that within your organization as a leader, how you could try and build a diverse team. What's your take, Autumn, on how that should be achieved? Are metrics, are legislation, KPIs, are those good, useful tools? Or should you be leading more with the carrot rather than kind of the stick, do you think, on these issues?
Okay. I'm going to start with the end of your question and then work backwards. I think anything that is working is measurable. And if you have lots of anecdotal reasons to believe that what you're doing is working, but you can't find it in the data, you're either looking at the wrong things or it's not actually working. But really, I don't think it should be a cudgel or a stick. I think it should be the relationship between you and this kind of data should be, is what we're doing working? Are we seeing our proofs? When it comes to building diversity in the workplace, though, I mean, I think that it would be very interesting to make sure that you're tracking like the diversity of teams and their ability to participate meaningfully with the shape that the work is taking, whether from the earliest stages, its development, its deployment. It just really depends on what field we're talking about here. I think that it's good to have the data to check against, but the truth of the matter is like, unless your company was like, okay, we're ready to hire 6 new people into your team, and then you went out of your way to make them diverse, you're not going to have that data to compare yourself against. So you then have to just go to the general, like, is this working as a team? I think that with diversity, bringing them in, obviously it's hiring. Something that irritates me is that I think that people stop talking about diversity from like the moment they've done hiring. But obviously there's a reason everybody goes to it. If you work at a place where like everybody has like a remarkably similar background in all ways, I mean, the only way you're going to start to address that is by hiring people, and that's a big part of it. But to go beyond that, I think the biggest thing that most companies need to do is make sure that they're actually creating ways and means for folks of all levels to share on all levels. So like to share when we're in the strategizing phase, to share in the design phase, to share in the deployment phase. And obviously that can get messy. You can't ask everyone all things. There need to be an orderly way forward to this. But I think the biggest thing that you can do is make sure that you're creating ways and means to inject that diversity in your group. And then obviously, I mean, I hope this goes without saying, but making sure that, you yourself, your team, the people you're responsible for, have the proper understanding of how to like navigate cultural contact and these sorts of things. Statistically, people are much more likely to have like negative experiences in these things when it's a cultural difference rather than a mere racial one. And so like, I don't know, an immigrant, somebody like a first generation Ugandan person working in a, let's say white office rather than merely a skin color difference. Like, but also women in the workplace and I hate this term, but like visibly queer or visibly disabled people, because then you're butting against differences. But I'd say for the most part, most people have trouble in their workplace though, because they don't feel like they can contribute on the ideas phase. I have an anecdote that would help with this. I worked with Matthias in the past at a place called Microverse. We had a wildly diverse team. That place was awesome, like so international, people just from all over. It was amazing. And we, on our team specifically, we had people from all over different backgrounds. And I thought I was so good about giving people a chance to like weigh in on our strategy and to raise problems. And like, I really like whiteboarding in meetings. I would come at these things and we'd all whiteboard. Man, I thought like no room for improvement here. And then one of the women on my team, who is a native Spanish speaker and speaks honestly beautiful English to the point where it didn't even occur to me she was ever not keeping up, because she seriously has maybe the best English of any non-native speaker who'd only been speaking for this long I've ever, I mean, incredible. She says, Autumn, you do these things and like, I don't think as quickly as I do in English as in Spanish. And sometimes I feel like I can't contribute because I'd have to think on my feet. And first off, so proud that I've created an environment where this girl could tell me that to my face. But also quite humbling, because you think you're just on top of the world. And I go around giving talks about this, and it just never occurred to me. It never occurred to me that because also I'm a person who thinks very well on their feet. So you don't even have to be a second language speaker. You can just be a person whose mind works differently than mine and likes to collect their thoughts. So I was like, okay, but I still want to have the energy of us meeting. So I started releasing the topics ahead, giving people time to like thinking about things asynchronously. And then we could come so they can gather their thoughts, because I wasn't giving one of the most talented people on my team, who's seriously so beautiful at thinking around corners. I bet you Matthias knows what I'm talking about. Like a chance to truly contribute. And by the time she thought of something, I'm sure a lot of the time she was like, wow, we've come too far. So I wasn't benefiting from her experience. And that is like a structural choice based on my blindness. You have to remember what is normal to you is not necessarily optimal or normal for another person. And if you're not going out of your way to create structures that bring those people in and create a normal that works for everybody, you're cutting out their experience. And really, it could not have been more meaningful, because this person in particular was truly gifted at risk assessment. And so the irony of cutting this person out of the conversation, like even when I'm going out of my way to try and include, was a big lesson, and it's a parable I like to tell people a lot.
I think one of the things I wanted to discuss with you was about some of the common mistakes that leaders make in kind of implementing diversity initiatives and creating that inclusive culture. That story kind of sums it up quite nicely, in as much as creating an environment where people are safe to come and talk to you, adapting your leadership style accordingly, because not always being the manager, but also being a sounding board and a coach, and creating that sort of environment is important for a leader, but also to then adapt what you're doing in order to meet the needs. And I think to be able to listen as a leader is probably one of the most important things, because you could have a team as diverse as you want, but if you're not listening to their input, you're not going to get that inclusive culture. You're not going to benefit from having that diverse team around you.
Absolutely. And I think, setting up mechanisms where people can give you that feedback anonymously as well, because not everyone is going to feel comfortable, no matter how hard you go out of your way to make them feel safe telling you that stuff. I mean, there is a patina around power and power differentials, and you just have to accept that as well. If you are the boss of anybody, even if you're just the boss of like a particular project, like you're the project lead here, you still have more authority than the next person. And also never underestimate people trying to be polite in the workplace, keeping them from sharing things. There are certain demographics that are linked to that more, but anyone can be reserved in this way. So I really do think it's important to set up, there's lots of tools. Most HR functionalities actually have a piece that does this, but if you're in a smaller company that doesn't have that, first up, I would raise, hey, we should get this. But, if not, you can put together anonymous polls or whatever and share them around yourself, or even ask like, like, these are the questions. Would you mind putting this together? I don't even want access to the back end. I want you to feel like, so that it feels transparent and like no one, nothing weird. You certainly could do that. You can also talk to your HR about it as well. But, people will give you feedback, but just make sure you're asking questions like that allow people to say if they feel like there are absences. But I also think one of the worst things that people in leadership do is not ask boots on the ground about a thing that they want to do. Okay, this is my favorite story. I hope you're ready. One time I was checking into a hotel and the line was very, very long because in the US, it's always at 4 when you can check in. And this one didn't allow for any kind of skipping the line, even though you could check in online on your phone. And it's not that the line was long, it's that it was moving insanely slow, like 15 minutes a person. And you're sitting here like, this is a solved issue. This has been, hospitality has figured out bringing people in. You have more people working the front desk this time of day, whatever. And the part of me that can't stop thinking about operations just all the time is like, what are they doing? Why is this happening? Like, what went wrong here? So after, seriously, a very long wait, like over an hour, I get up there. Normally checking in takes what? Especially if you've already done it online. Also, if you can do it online, why can't I just pick up my key? Whatever. I get up there. And the reason that this is taking so long, it's like, you get those plastic room keys. Normally they give you 2. They were giving 1 for every person in your party. So if we were 3 people, they gave us 3 keys. And every one of those keys had the name of the guest on it. So it's like Autumn Huffman, my partner Jacob Huffman, our kid Huffman, right? And I'm sitting here like, oh, and they're also printing them right now. That's what's taking so long, every one of these. And I walked away. I could not stop laughing. I was like, listen, somebody up here in this boardroom is like, you can imagine them with like a deck behind them and like a laser pointer or something being like, this is the biggest, it's a Disney World trip. I live in Florida. If you don't take your kids to Disney World, like once a year, like the government will take your kids away. You got to go. You're a bad parent. And so I'm obviously joking, but it's intense. People are like, this is the biggest trip some people are going to take all year. And, we want them to feel like they are the VIPs. And, at our hotel, we're giving a VIP experience. And wouldn't it be amazing? They'll all have their name on it. Even the children, which is, by the way, a huge security risk, but whatever. Even the children will have their own key. And wouldn't that be so special? And all of these muckety mucks who have never stayed in one of their own hotels. And if they have, they go in some back entrance to the penthouse, who haven't lived like a real life in a number of years are like, oh, well done, Sharon. Great presentation. Let's fact trust this. It's like, you'll have to talk to anybody who works at a hotel because every single one of these people would have been like, you do not do anything that overcomplicates check-in. You do not do anything that slows that down. And it was just such a miss. And I just want to say, that is a part of thinking diversely. It's not just identity politics. It is also the functionality of the person in the role. And if you do not stop what you are doing and ask a boot on the ground about your idea before you design and implement, you have failed. I'm sorry. Learn from your mistake. We all make mistakes, but you have truly failed. Don't just talk to the manager of the team. Go to the manager and say, I would like your feedback, but I'd also like one of your people. Pick one and then rotate him up. Don't always give me, Alan. I also want, Jamal and Sharon and Kim Wan and whoever, like whoever you got, not the same person every time so that you'll see. And also when you do retros at the end, hopefully we're all doing retros to see if our research did well, if our method did well. Don't just ask the people that worked on the project. Ask the people who are impacted by the project, how it worked so that you can, have a better experience next time.
You've got an advert there of a bot.
I'm in the position where I have to make people slowly aware of time because we're at 45 minutes. I wanted to, as we've done before, I know Vicky has put something into the chat as well with regards to questions. I think yeah, so anyone who wants to kind of raise a question, so do so in the chat or kind of raise your hand now. That's very much invited. I think I would always like to look at it from the perspective, because that's what we're kind of trying to build a community around, is people who are trying to kind of move into leadership positions and, well, maybe not avoid the mistakes that they'll make, but I do wonder sometimes what are the kind of probably attributes one needs to develop in oneself in order to be inclusive and open in the way we are kind of driving our own careers. Don't know, open question to anyone maybe. What are the attributes that you think would be required? Oh,
I would say
Daniela.
listening to, I mean, listening is such an important skill. I mean, the number one skill really of communication is being able to take other people's opinions on board. And I like the idea of learning from those, multiple levels in the organization. You hear about those companies that when they take on managers, they force them to go and do some shop floor work. So, if it's UPS, you have to go driving. If it's some famous Japanese companies that make people go and work kind of on the factory floor to learn about that.
Kaizen as a principle, that's what I thought about. It was an interesting thing from Daniela. I think we've talked a little bit about this, but I wonder what aspiring leaders can do to address unconscious bias. So that's the first kind of question. So what can aspiring leaders can do to address unconscious bias?
So this is a great question, because I think my top level answer also answers the question that Matthias said, but you need to have a lot of humility, and with that self-knowledge, you really, I think it's very helpful to start by asking yourself, like, what are my unique offerings? In career services, I'd call it like your unique selling proposition, but like, what are my unique offerings? When I'm on a team with a lot of people similar to me, what are my unique things? How do I feel like I offer differently? And then ask yourself that question about someone else. Like, okay, well, what have they offered? Sort of train yourself first to just observe things in your recent experience, because that starts getting your mind noticing what people have to offer. Don't ask yourself based on their background. I mean, unless it's obvious, like, oh, well, this person has a science background and they always have this great science thing. And I mean, sometimes it's profoundly obvious, but you don't have to get into like this, like, because they're gay, they had this thing. It doesn't always have to be tied to this deep reason rooted to like what you think makes them diverse. Because again, people aren't one thing. If you're slotting people entirely into a definition of diversity based on like the one thing that makes them visibly different than you, you're doing like the inverse of the 90s colorblind thing. It is their entire lifetime and the way their brain works and like, that made them this person you're interacting with right now. And I think that if you train yourself to start observing those things, it's easier for you to observe these dynamics as they're going. And then from there, in terms of unconscious bias, I mean, the truth of the matter is it's a mixture of just becoming hyper aware of how you work and how you work differently than others, accepting that they do the same thing as you, in that they work a certain way and they may or may not observing how other people are working differently. And I don't even mean like working, like, I mean, working, thinking, interacting, reacting. If you could sort of accept all those things, and then you add a layer of, reading some of the really excellent literature out there about the way unconscious bias tends to form, then you're mixing together the toolkit of being able to observe yourself and others with the knowledge that will erase some of your blind spots. Because the truth of the matter is, it is not possible for you to not have blind spots, period. And it's never going to stop being impossible. I know I could do this for the rest of my life and become like the world's most leading expert on this, and I will still have blind spots because I am limited to my own subjectivity no matter how much I try. So then the next piece is talking to people. And sometimes it's not actually talking, like sometimes it is, again, reading and taking their ideas, and you can't actually talk back to them, but accepting, like getting to know other viewpoints so that you can recognize them more easily. And then lastly, there are a lot of tools, like to root it back down. Unconscious bias, where it is limiting certain factors, there are a lot of tools that give you more data on your behaviors. There's some really good ones that like allow you to kind of make sure you're passing around like project leadership, mentoring opportunities, things like that. Also like doing things with your team that allow them to do like skill matrices that they participate on and then make visible to them like how exciting it is that we have like a balance of teams and they're all different. There's a lot of these, Gallup or whatever. You could say like, and then take that as an opportunity to like celebrate where people are strong and, so like, okay, I'd like you to build a team. Ideally, you would want people with these expertise. What are you thinking? And then, talk to me and I'll see as a manager if I can free all those people up for this project. Because I might not be able to, in which case you're just going to have to deal with it because that's life. But like, well, you'll get them next time, and trying to vary the groups that people are in. And honestly, if you just keep changing up that syntax and accepting that you have blind spots and trying actively to be aware of them and also be aware if you have them, other people have them, help them see their own, create a culture where you can talk about that. Like, well, something I don't think you're thinking about is that for our female clients, it might, oh, I didn't like female. For our women clients that might read like this, or something you're not thinking about is that falls on, I don't know, the first day of Eid or something. Like, you can start bringing these things up and encouraging that. I hope that was a good answer. Somebody asked in the chat about longevity at companies. I know we're about done.
Yes, I was just about to lead into that. Are you clear about this, or do we need a slightly kind of contextualizing in this context?
I will just say generally, longevity going less is something that a lot of career professionals are actually encouraging. Because honestly, this is how you get paid more and get promotions. So I think sort of the thing is that the culture is changing where like more and more people are doing this. I do recognize that you can get to a point in your career where this is no longer the case. And there are certain career fields that look down on it more, but I'm just going to say that this is a change overall in industries writ large. It is just, like I said, earlier about like changing cultural zeitgeist. Like when my dad, for instance, was a guy, he's like one of those people who was hired like as an entry-level sales guy and worked himself up to be in the C-suite, which is the most boomer thing I can think of happening. That doesn't happen. And I'm sure it happens like anecdotally, we can name a few, but like that's not a thing. If you want to do that, you have to just keep changing jobs, until you get to a certain level, and then you just keep amassing reputation or whatever at that place, perhaps. But like, there was like a record number of CFO jobs posted last year because people change jobs now. It's just a part of it. And I understand that can be challenging, but if that's what the culture is doing, then I recommend you swim with the stream and then just be aware of like your opportunities. However, if you mean this in any way about like diversity or people leaving, there are huge retention issues with companies that bring in diverse people and they do nothing to include them, because that's where a bunch of unconscious bias and microaggressions and promoting, let's say, traditional, whatever that means to you, traditional candidates over others, and overlooking people, and all the boots in the ground are your visually, I hate that, visually diverse people, and then none of your leaders are, or leaders can't get above middle management, and those people leave because they should, because they're not being treated right. If you're there and you want to try and prove it, do what you can. Make people aware that this is a problem, that our retention rates are garbage, use the KPIs that are saying this isn't working, suggest change. If no one listens to you, you should leave because you're not being valued either. And that's it. I hope that answered your question, Jack. I tried to go quick because I know we're at time.
Well, I have to say that's probably good closing statement because I think kind of fully agree on the side of that we've as careers professionals have seen the times that people spend getting ever shorter, and I think that's probably also a sign of a more flexible attitude in society as how what is kind of acceptable. You don't have to work 20 years somewhere if done well in order to gain the acclaim that you may deserve. And moving on when you're not feeling valued is probably the kind of strongest weapon that you have. So I think from my perspective, I think we can probably slowly bring proceedings to a close. Vicky, what's your take?
Yeah, no, that was great, Autumn. Thank you. I mean, we could have gone on for longer. So many things to ask. But if just out of your interest, just very quickly in the last minute, if there's leaders who want to champion diversity and don't know where to start, where's good to go and look? What books could they pick up? Blogs, podcasts? What would you advise?
That's a really excellent question. I guess if it were me, I would start actually by following voices actually on LinkedIn and your social media. The reason I like this is because these people are sharing books all the time and resources and articles. In terms of entire books, I like a lot of stuff on The Cultural Context Zone is a really good book. I think it takes a more traditional look at diversity, but I think that the implications in it can be written just as large as possible. I think it's a really good place to start getting you thinking outside of your own comfort zone. But in a more local level, I would talk to your boss and leaders at your job or previous bosses or whatever about how this is something that you're really getting interested in and what are the biggest lessons that they have learned personally. What is the biggest mistake that they have made personally? As much as possible, ask people about their experiences. You're going to learn more by asking people and having a conversation with them at the beginning of your own journey. I think you'll learn a lot more that way. And then if there are groups at your job, like identity groups that would work for you, like, for instance, I was in like a queer group at one of my last jobs or whatever. Like, obviously, if you're not queer, maybe don't go. But like, it worked for me because it's a really good way to connect with people in other areas of your business that may be having similar experience. And you can ask them like, hey, like, do you feel included? Like, why or why not? And see where that maps on yours. And then share that in your next meeting. Like, hey, I've been thinking about this a lot. This is an area. Does anyone have areas where they're being impacted here? And that might be different than this or similar, and see what people say. And then also say, hey, you can also write me if you don't want to talk about this but in front of a bunch of people. That would be my recommendation, is starting the conversation and being open to the results.
Awesome. Thank you. Really sound advice there. So we are at time. We are on the hour. Thank you so much, Autumn. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all of you who had questions in the chat. Matthias, I think we'll close.
Goodness.